They always tell you that buying your first home is supposed to be the pinnacle of the American dream. The moment where you finally close the door on the world and find your own little sanctuary. But let me tell you, that dream can turn into a grade A psychological thriller faster than you can unpack your moving boxes. I spent 20 years working double shifts and saving every spare dime to afford this place. A beautiful mid-century modern gem tucked away in a quiet, leafy suburb of Virginia. And for the first month, it was perfect until the morning I woke up to a sound that definitely was and oppos. A bird chirping. It was the distinct, rhythmic thwack splash of a professional-grade diving board, followed by a burst of high-pitched laughter and the smell of cheap coconut tanning oil wafting through my open bedroom window. I remember lying there for a second, staring at the ceiling and thinking maybe I'd accidentally checked into a Marriott, but then I realized I was in my own bed, in the house I paid nearly $700,000 for, and someone was currently performing a cannonball in my backyard. I stumbled out of bed, threw on a robe, and pulled back the curtains to find a scene that was so absurd I actually checked my pulse to make sure I wasn't oppos. Dreaming. There were 3 women, all in their late 50s, lounging in my pool like they were at a 5-star resort in Cabo. One was floating on a giant inflatable peacock. Another was sipping a margarita from a plastic tumbler. And the ringleader, a woman with a stiff blonde bob and a sun half the size of a satellite dish, was currently rearranging my patio furniture to better catch the morning rays. I didn't oppose. To even put on shoes, I just marched out onto the deck, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I managed to choke out a very confused and quote, "Excuse me, what exactly are you doing in my yard?" End quote. The ringleader didn't oppose. To even look startled, she just lowered her oversized designer sunglasses, looked me up and down with this expression of pure, unadulterated pity, and said in a voice that sounded like pearls rattling in a velvet bag, end quote, "Oh, honey, you must be the new tenant in the Miller House. I'm Beatrice, the head of the Architectural Review Committee for the HOA, and you really shouldn't oppose. TB out here in your pajamas. It's a bit unsightly for the neighbors," end quote. I stood there, blinking, trying to process the sheer audacity of being told my robe was, end quote, unsightly, end quote, by a woman trespassing in my pool, and I said as firmly as I could, end quote, "I'm not a tenant, I'm the owner, and this is private property, not a public park. So I'm going to need you to pack up your peacock and leave right now," end quote. Beatrice let out this sharp, barking laugh and exchanged a look with her friends. Let's call them the minions. And she sighed as if she were explaining basic math to a toddler, saying, end quote, "Sweetheart, this lot has a historical easement. The previous owners, the Millers, always allowed the board to use this facility for and oppos, community brainstorming sessions and oppos. So why don an oppos? Till you go back inside. Make yourself some coffee and let us finish our meeting in peace," end quote. That was the moment I realized I was an oppos. Dealing with a simple misunderstanding. I was dealing with a local warlord who had spent 15 years treating this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, and she clearly didn't oppose. Think the deed in my safe meant a damn thing compared to her, end quote. Brainstorming sessions, end quote. I went back inside because I was too stunned to fight, but I spent the next 4 hours reading every single line of my closing documents, my title insurance, and the HOA bylaws. And guess what? There was no easement, no, end quote, community brainstorming, end quote, clause, nothing but a standard residential deed. I tried to do things the right way, I really did. So, I scheduled a meeting with the HOA president, a guy named Julian who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of expensive soap and spent most of his life avoiding eye contact. I showed him the photos of the women in my pool. I showed him my deed, and I expected him to be horrified, but instead he just leaned back in his leather chair, sighed, and told me that Beatrice was, end quote, deeply invested, end quote, in the character of the neighborhood. He told me that she'd been on the board since the Clinton administration and that, end quote, ruffling her feathers, end quote, this early in my residency would likely result in a sudden influx of fines for my grass being half an inch too long or my mailbox being the wrong shade of eggshell. It was a shakedown, plain and simple, and Julian basically told me that my private property was the price I had to pay for a quiet life, but the problem is I don't like being told what to do with things I've earned, and I definitely don and oppose, like being bullied in my own backyard. Over the next 2 weeks, it became a war of attrition. I'd lock the side gate with a heavy-duty chain, and I'd come home to find the chain cut with bolt cutters or the latch filed down so it wouldn't into oppos. T-catch. I'd find wet towels draped over my expensive teak chairs, empty seltzer cans in my flower beds, and once I even found a half-eaten charcuterie board sitting on my diving board like some kind of sacrifice to the gods of entitlement. I tried calling the non-emergency police line, but when the officer showed up, Beatrice was already there, smiling and handing him a bottle of water, telling him it was just a, and quote, dispute over shared amenities, and quote, between neighbors and the cop, who clearly didn't in oppos. To want to spend his afternoon mediating a suburban pool fight. Just told us to, and quote, work it out among yourselves, and quote. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was a ghost in my own home, watching this woman colonize my space. With her sun hats and her smug, and quote, I own this town, and quote, energy, and that's when I realized that if the law wouldn't end oppos, T helped me, and the HOA wouldn't end oppos. T helped me. I had to stop playing by their rules and start playing by mine. I have an old friend from college, Leo, who's a senior researcher in organic chemistry. The kind of guy who spends his days looking at molecular structures and his nights thinking of ways to use science for mischief. I called him up, explained the situation, and I told him I didn't in oppos. Do you want to hurt anyone? I didn't in oppos. Do you want to poison the water or do anything illegal? I just want a way to make the trespassing undeniable and, ideally, a little bit embarrassing. Leo listened, laughed for about 5 minutes straight, and then he told me about a specific type of fluorescent, non-toxic tracer dye used in hydrological studies. It's completely clear in the water, safe for skin, and invisible under normal conditions. But it has a very interesting reaction when it comes into contact with high concentrations of certain zinc-based physical blockers. And as it happened, Beatrice was a devotee of a very specific, very expensive, very thick white sunscreen that she slathered on like she was frosting a cake before she ever touched the water. Leo sent me a small, concentrated vial of the stuff, and I spent a Friday night acting like a suburban secret agent, documenting everything. I recorded the pH of the water, the temperature, and the exact moment I added the tracer, keeping a meticulous log in case I ever had to prove this in court. I set up 3 high-definition 4K cameras hidden in the eaves of my roof and tucked into the birdhouses, covering every single angle of the pool and the gate. And then I just waited. Saturday morning came, bright and blistering, the kind of day that practically screams for a dip in a cool pool, and around 10:30 a.m., I heard the familiar clack of the gate being forced open. I sat in my darkened kitchen, watching the live feed on my tablet as Beatrice and her 2 cohorts marched in, looking like they were ready for a photo shoot. Beatrice was wearing a leopard print swimsuit, and true to form, she spent 10 minutes meticulously applying that thick, white zinc sunscreen to her face, shoulders, and arms until she looked like a kabuki actor. She stood at the edge of the pool, did a little graceful toe dip, and then slid into the water with this sigh of absolute triumph. And for a few minutes, everything was normal, but then as the sun hit the water at just the right angle, the reaction started. It wasn't an oppos, a slow change. It was like a neon green cloud started blooming out from her skin, swirling around her like a radioactive aura, and within 60 seconds, every part of her body that had been covered in that sunscreen was glowing with a vibrant, highlighter green intensity that made her look like she just crawled out of a nuclear cooling tank. She didn't in oppos. T noticed at first. She was too busy gossiping about the neighbor in oppos. S news shudders, but then one of her friends shrieked and pointed, and Beatrice looked down at her arms and let out a sound that I can only describe as a prehistoric bird call. She scrambled out of the pool, dripping neon green onto my white stone deck, and she started frantically rubbing her skin, but the more she rubbed, the more the dye reacted with the oils and the lotion, turning her entire torso into a glowing Shrek-colored masterpiece. I didn't in oppos. TL, I didn't in oppos. T-storm out there. I just opened my back door, leaned against the frame with my phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, and I said very calmly, and quote, "Oh dear, Beatrice, it looks like you're having a bit of a reaction to the end oppos. Community water and oppos. Maybe you should head home and see if some heavy-duty dish soap takes it off." End quote. She looked at me with this expression of pure, unbridled fury, her face a mask of neon green and white streaks. And she started screaming about, in quote, chemical warfare, in quote, and in quote, lawsuits, in quote, and how she was going to have me, in quote, run out of town on a rail, in quote. I just pointed to the sign I'd prominently displayed on the fence that morning, a sign she'd walked right past, which read, and oppos, warning, private research facility. Water treated with non-toxic tracing agents for leak detection. Do not enter. And oppos, I told her, in quote, I documented the application, I have the safety data sheets, and most importantly, I have 4K footage of you breaking into a marked research zone. So if you want to call the police, please be my guest. I'd love to show them the video of the oppos. Arkhead and oppos, committing a felony. End quote. The aftermath was a glorious, slow-motion train wreck for the HOA board, because Beatrice, in her infinite wisdom, decided to go to the local emergency room to, end quote, document the assault, end quote. But the doctors there just laughed and told her it was a harmless cosmetic dye that would fade in 48 hours. However, the hospital report became public record, and because she had been so loud about it on the neighborhood Facebook group, everyone started asking why she was in my pool in the first place. That curiosity led to a few younger, more tech-savvy neighbors doing some digging, and they found out that Beatrice had been using HOA funds to pay for the, end quote, maintenance, end quote, of my pool for the last decade. The previous owners have been in on it, taking a kickback to let the board use the property as their private club. When the audit finally hit, it turned out there was nearly $50,000 in, end quote, community enhancement, end quote, funds that had actually gone toward Beatrice's personal travel and, end quote, consulting fees, end quote. And suddenly, the woman who ruled the neighborhood with an iron sun hat was being served with an embezzlement lawsuit. Julian, the soap car president, resigned within the week to avoid being implicated, and the entire board was dissolved and replaced by people who actually cared about things like, property rights and not stealing from their neighbors. Beatrice ended up selling her house and moving 2 towns over, presumably to find a new pool to colonize, and the first thing the new board did was send me a formal apology and a gift certificate to a local landscaping company to repair the gate she destroyed. I sit out by my pool now, and it's quiet, truly quiet, and the water is a perfect, boring, crystal clear blue, and sometimes I think about the fact that it took a little bit of neon green to finally see the truth of what was happening in this community. But here's the thing that's been on my mind lately, and I want to know what you think. Was I wrong to take it that far? Some people in the neighborhood still think I was, in quote, cruel, end quote, for humiliating an older woman, even if she was a thief and a bully, while others say it was the only way to break a corrupt system that had been in place for 20 years. So, I'm curious, where do you draw the line between defending your home and becoming the very person everyone fears? If you were in my shoes, would you have played it safe, or would you have reached for the neon dye? Drop a comment below and let me know, because honestly, I'm still not sure if I'm the hero of this story or just the most dangerous neighbor on the block.